Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shahriyar Chugtai from ADB's Office of Markets Development and Public-Private Partnerships. Warm welcome to you all on this session on structuring and financing Pathfinder climate projects in new sectors. So we will have welcome remarks from the head of Office of Markets Development and PPPs, followed by 4 case study presentations, because seeing is believing. So we will have 4 sessions, 4 case study presentations on green hydrogen, clean cooking, district heating, and marine floating solar, followed by a panel discussion as well as closing remarks. So without further ado, if I may invite Ms. Cleo Kawawaki, Head of our Office of Markets Development and PPPs, for the welcome remarks.
Good afternoon. How's your energy level today? Are you all tired? I mean, it is 4 o'clock, so I guess this is the last thing before you're freed from these ASEF meetings. But I hope we can get your energy level up, because this is a very exciting topic for me. Doing Pathfinder projects or having new technologies is what we live for. And as an energy specialist for most of my life, I was always trying to find something newer and better and solutions, technology or efficiency. But that always came with a lot of pain, I mean, I worked on the same project for like 8 years trying to find a solution. And it only came with a change in ADB's regulation to be able to do it, So, but that made all of the difference in moving the needle for technology. I mean, it's overwhelming, blood and tears, but this is where what we live for in moving the planet. And, looking at the jeopardy we're all in with climate change, we have to find new solutions for these issues. And the panel beforehand, one of the speakers was saying that investment in marginal technologies may be our only hope in getting through climate change. So this is what we want to do with Pathfinder projects. We need trillions of dollars to decarbonize the economy and reduce emissions. And neither of the funds or the creativity will come from public sector or donors. We can't depend on them for that. We need the innovation and efficiency and capital of the private sector. Pathfinder projects require strong collaboration among stakeholders, including governments, project sponsors, the advisors, and lenders, in order to ensure that the projects are bankable, because we can't count on the private sector, of course not, if the projects are not bankable. And then because to be able to have it to be bankable, you need bankable risk allocation, and especially for governments here, the value for money. ADB, for our part, tries to make the projects bankable through our upstream support or our legal regulatory support with our sector colleagues, and through our transaction advisory support, we assist the governments with technical, regulatory, and commercial challenges. And we act as the honest broker in the structuring and bidding and commercial challenges process. And we all even go all the way up to the implementation when the governments invite us to do so. So we have very intriguing case studies for you today that I hope will stroke some of your imagination and for going further with innovative solutions in our battle against climate crisis. And I look forward to your active participation in the discussion portion. And if you have any great ideas, please, whisper it in my ear so we can go to our clients and make it come true. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cleo. So now we move on to the 4 case presentations. The first one is from Ankit Chaturvedi, Partners Energy Consulting, on green hydrogen. Ankit, over to you.
Thank you, Sharyar. Thank you, everyone, for coming down in this post-lunch and towards the fag end of the day. I hope everyone is energetic, as Cleo mentioned earlier. So we'll talk about green hydrogen. Now, as an organization, we have worked on quite a few green hydrogen projects across multiple geographies. We have done this in Oman, in Egypt, in parts of Central Asia and Middle East. So these are the geographies where there is a lot of activity which has happened over the last 3 years, 3+ years in the green hydrogen sector. Now, why green hydrogen? Um, we heard Cleo talk about sustainable projects, something which we need for net zero by 2050. For some of the other countries, for the developing countries, it's slightly longer, but then this is um, one source or one project which helps target achieving net zero by these defined targets dates. Similarly, it enables large scale renewable energy storage. So that's where the whole genesis of green hydrogen as a concept started. And whether you talk about green hydrogen, convert it into green ammonia, uh, ammonia more because it's easy in terms of transporting it from one region to another region, or pure hydrogen, utilize it in the fuel cells or whatever. And then finally, because it also helps in distributed systems of renewable energy. So you do not need, theoretically, you do not need grid support, but that's an area which becomes a bit more complex and requires a lot more analysis and a lot more structuring before we talk about pure distributed large scale installations of green hydrogen or green ammonia. Now, again, I'm going back to the point that Cleo mentioned that we need bankable project structures. And that's where green hydrogen, green ammonia becomes extremely critical. Back when we started talking about green hydrogen, the first project that we took to the banks in 2021, the first question that came up was, okay, how do we categorize these projects, whether this is a renewable energy project or is it a chemical project? Which part of DFI or an ECA needs to look at this project? So in terms of Pathfinder, you need to start with creating a structure, internal structure for the banks to start looking at these kind of projects. Um, of course, from a particular project perspective, there are the usual technological aspects, the regulatory aspects, offtake structuring, considerations for EPC, O&M, lender requirements, sponsor requirements, and some of the other lender requirements. Now, I'll talk about all of these in subsequent slides, but out of all of this, the most important one is the offtake. So as long as you have clarity and a bankable structure around the offtake, everything else will fall in place. So that's the most critical element of all of these considerations. This is a general structure of how a green hydrogen or a green ammonia project looks like. So again, for some of you who would have not possibly seen this previously, but the broad idea is that you have a renewable energy source, and this could be solar, wind, and also something like a run-of-river hydro. So run-of-river hydro is also being considered for many of the upcoming green hydrogen projects. From here, the ideal case is this is co-located with the green hydrogen facilities, but it could also be transmitted through the grid. The next step is the electrolyzer, where the green hydrogen gets produced. Um, it could go into an ammonia loop, depending on whether we are using green ammonia as the end product or not. And the related elements are all captured over here. So I'll skip over this because this is more from a technical perspective. Right. Now, if we look at some of the risk elements and where, when we took many of our transactions to the lending market, the challenges that we faced and how do we structure these elements. there are very limited precedents for utility scale electrolyzers. Even now, after like 2-3 years, there are examples of pilot projects which have done work for last 2-3 years. Some of the pilot projects got commissioned in mid of 2020 or early 21. So you have data coming in from these projects, but these are all smaller scale, pilot scale projects. The good part is that electrolyzers are modular in nature. So even if we use the pilot project, there is a lot of comfort that could be derived from the data that we get from these electrolyzers. But this is something where lenders take time to get comfortable. The other element is about the interfacing. It is the interfacing between the renewable generation and electrolyzers, as well as other components, whether it is from electrolyzers to the um, synthesizer of ammonia and so on. So there is again limited track record around this, limited contractors who have done this, and this was one of the major challenge that we came across. You would get contractors who have done one part of the value chain, renewable energy. You'll get very easily a lot of contractors who can work over there. You will get contractors who do desalination. You will get for the ammonia synthesizer, because that's again, the technology has been in the industry for quite a long period. But where you would struggle is a contractor who could integrate all of these elements, and that's something where some of the sponsors, they need to come up, they need to wrap this risk and make sure that the overall structure is bankable. Um, Variable generation. So this is related to the interfacing, where the generation from renewable by definition is intermittent and variable. So that has an impact on the overall efficiency and performance of electrolyzers. And it also leads in faster replacement cycles, faster maintenance, all of that. And this goes back to the earlier point where we have limited track record. So this needs to be a proper long-term track record is needed before the lenders can get more comfortable around this. Of course, from a structuring perspective, what this means is you have bigger buffers on the O&M side, on the debt service reserve accounts, which takes care of some of these risks. Yeah, I think that's broadly, of course, one element which could be further used to mitigate this risk is by combining some of the other sources using grid power. It has its challenges, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Easiest out of all of this would be to use hydropower in the mix, because that's more stable generation, and that would mitigate many of these challenges. Green hydrogen certification, this is important, where you need a proper certification to make sure that the produce is acceptable in the global markets. There are public regulatory schemes, there are voluntary schemes, but I think the crux of either of these is something what we cover over here. I would say there are three major pillars of regulatory requirements. Geographical correlation. The sites need to be, or the different components of green hydrogen, green ammonia needs to be co-located. Additionality. The power needs to be, the power components needs to be recent. It shouldn't be historic or the legacy projects which are getting utilized. And temporal correlation. This becomes extremely important. So you cannot effectively bank your green energy and utilize grid energy for generation. So temporal correlation becomes extremely important. I think I have time limits, so I'll quickly wrap up. So on the offtake side, as I said, this is the most important, and the challenge from the offtakers is about the fixed price that they are not used to, especially in the ammonia market. They are more used to input driven or the feedstock driven prices, Whereas for long-term sustainability, what's needed is fixed price and long-term contracts, which is, and along with a termination and a take-up pay, typical project finance kind of a structure that you would expect in any other utility project. This is something which the off-takers of green hydrogen ammonia, they are not used to it. And that's where there is an intervention which is required from policymakers, from DFIs, donors, so as to get the private sector, and many of these off-takers are private sector. So you need to make sure that there is comfort over there. And that's how many of these projects can be well structured and taken forward. I'll stop over here because I notice that I've run over time, but we can talk about. I think many of the other points are similar that we have talked about earlier. So EPC O&M contractors, which needs to be new technology. There is a lot more support that's needed from either the sponsor or some other party. But for green hydrogen sector as such, this is something which is more best handled by the project sponsors. On the lenders side, we have talked about the DSCRs and the buffers that we need to include, given the technology and given the novelty element of it. One other element is about the split versus integrated SPV structure. This is critical because you could, one easy way is to split up the components. Renewable energy by another SPV, desal by another. You have some another project company which is handling the ammonia synthesis, so on and so forth. It is, in theory, it works, but from a lender perspective, the difficulty is you would have a lot more interfacing risk, and that's where it becomes challenging. This has been explored in some of the projects. Some lenders are more comfortable because it gives clarity on at least the renewable energy component, which could be 40-50% of the total project cost. So from that perspective, it makes a lot more sense to separate out renewable energy component, but then it has its own challenges from a contractual and technical perspective. Yeah, and the final point is around land. The project needs to be in a location which has abundant land. It is closer to the seaport, closer to some of the grid locations, and that's where it's kind of natural. Where many of our earlier projects, they have come up in locations like Oman, Egypt, where you have very good irrigation, you have very good wind resource, and these kind of projects make sense. I'll stop over here. If you have any particular questions or any points that we can discuss, I'm around. We can speak about it. Thank you. Thank you for listening for me. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming here. I'm here to talk about a very interesting transaction that private sector operations department of ADB did last year. It's an improved cook stoves transaction. And this is the first time really that ADB financed a project, and the private sector arm of ADB financed a project where 100% of the revenues are from sale of carbon credits. So move this forward. This slide is just a brief slide on why carbon credits are important. We do think they have an important role to play in overall decarbonization. We do see them playing an important role in the next maybe 5 to 10, 15-year range till there are technologies available for the hard to abate sectors. We think they're a very important bridge. This particular transaction, it's a community-based project on improved cook stoves. The first image you see, really, actually both the images, they really talk about the adverse impact of the traditional cook stoves, which are used by a very large population in developing countries and in India in particular for this project. The first image is of a woman cooking, and there's a child behind her, which really sort of encapsulates the issues. So you have a traditional 3-brick cook stove where people fetch firewood and burn it to cook food. It causes a lot of pollution and takes up a lot of time for women to collect the fuel wood. In this particular project, ADB's client wanted to distribute 1 million cook stoves in 2 particular states in India to the rural population. There were a few challenges they faced because they were addressing people at the bottom of the pyramid, really. Those people didn't even have the capacity to pay the $25 to $30 upfront cost of the cook stove. So, so that's really where the financing challenge came up. The company owns a manufacturing facility for cook stoves and has been operating it for the last 5-7 years. They've tried working with microfinance institutions and the likes also to distribute cook stoves. But through this project, I think we came up with an innovative way. The end users got the cook stoves at a very steep discount of about 80 to 85%. So effectively, they were just paying about $2 to $3 per cook stove. They were educated about the benefits of the cook stoves, and the company recovered this money through will be recovering this money through sale of carbon credits. This particular project has been registered in the voluntary carbon market space. There are no Article 6 guidelines currently in India which cover cook stoves as such. There were financing challenges faced because 1 million cook stoves had to be distributed. The cost would be around $35 million, plus the moment you distribute the cook stoves, you need to provide maintenance support, education support to the end user so that they do end up using it over a long period of time. All that costs money, plus the cost of registering the project. So the overall project cost was about $38 to $40 million, and the challenge was how to finance it upfront, which is where ADB really stepped in. Essentially, there's a timing mismatch because eventually your funds come in when the carbon credits get generated but they do get generated over a period of time. Now, again, this image talks quite a lot. A typical improved cook stove is just slightly better engineering design, which gives you higher thermal efficiency than the traditional cook stove does. And because it gives you higher thermal efficiency, it ends up using lesser fuel wood to produce the same amount of heat, which can give you GHG emission reductions and lead to generation of carbon credits. ADB has provided $6.5 million in debt to this company. The balance funds have been, carbon credits are going to be generated over a 7-year period, which is the cook stove life. ADB has provided about a 6-year debt tenor. We did due diligence on technical, market, legal aspects of the project. This was first of a kind project. We did draw upon existing knowledge that ADB has. We've had a carbon desk for a very long time and very knowledgeable on that. And we also brought in a little bit of concessional funds to provide a first loss cover to the debt providers for part of the debt facility. This would help mitigate the risk of a very small sponsor. The sponsor was a very, very small company, almost like a startup, not a very high revenue, and didn't have a lot of market resilience. So we used concessional funds not to give a grant to the company, but to provide a first loss support to the debt, to part of the debt for the tenor of the financing. There was a lot of additionality in this project. This company was one that was not able to raise financing from the market. They'd been trying for a while. So ADB has actually provided financing which is not available in the market. This project does have a high demonstrative impact on the sector as well. We do believe that this transaction is replicable and scalable across community-based projects. There were a lot of other co-benefits of this project, which an improved cook stove solution does get, mostly on the gender front. And there were also environment and social benefits. And I will stop here. It's a very short presentation, but I hope it covers everything.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I am Grace Misa. I also come from the same team with Cleo and Sharyar, the Office of Markets Development and PPP. So PPP stands for Public-Private Partnership, for those who's not familiar. I'm very excited and proud to present this project, which is Central Asia's very first district heating project through a PPP. This specifically is for the Tashkent District Heating Network. Okay, so for those who's not familiar, what is a district heating network? It's similar to a district cooling network. So it's basically a model for energy where you use a central location for energy generation and use pipelines to convey the heat or disseminate the heat through this network of pipelines. In the case of Tashkent, which is Uzbekistan's biggest district heating network, covering, I think, about 70% of the whole network in the country, this was built back in the Soviet times, so 1950s, about 70 years ago. And since then, there has been no investment, no maintenance, no upkeep to any part, any sector, any section of the network. So that means a lot of inefficiencies coming from the pipelines, coming from lost thermal energy, water leakages. And on top of that, the network itself, because it was designed so long ago, it was designed as an open system, which no network right now is designed. We're all using a closed loop system now, which is more efficient, where everything is loop within the network. So all of that means, including pipelines that are much bigger than needed and using outdated materials, all of that means that the consumers were basically dealing with an unreliable heating supply every winter season. Lots of breakdowns, lots of accidents. And for the government, that also meant lots of subsidies pouring into the network for suboptimal services. So the government also realizes that private sector needs to intervene. They need the efficiencies and the know-how of the private sector. So that's why they thought, okay, let's do a PPP for this project. So ADB came to help them and advise on how to do this as a PPP. We were dealing with a couple of considerations or challenges when we first dealt with them in 2019. First was that the district heating sector in Uzbekistan is very highly regulated. And this is unlike other markets where it's quite open, and that lends itself to a more investor-friendly environment. So it was quite the opposite in Uzbekistan. And to top it off, these regulations are also based on outdated systems and outdated technology. So that was another challenge for us and the government itself. 2019 was when we conceptualized this with the government, when we helped them come up with a project. And it was also that time when the government first enacted its PPP law. So it's very new, and distribution PPPs are also untested naturally. So we took that into consideration. And the network itself, the project itself, dealt with an expansive network. As I mentioned, it covers 2.5 million people, almost 70% of the entire country's district heating network. So this meant a huge upfront cost or a huge capital expenditure just to modernize and improve the physical assets themselves. Because it's expansive and covering the entire city, you can't just do this all in one go either. So we knew that you had to do this across a long period of time. So it was about, our investment plan involves about 20 to 25 years of continuous improvement in physical assets. Lastly, we needed to make sure that for such a project, the partnership between the private sector and the public partner, the counterpart, was strong all throughout. It's a special kind of project where you couldn't just let go or just leave it all up to the private sector. The public partner had to also do its share and be more than a regulator. So taking all this, it was deemed appropriate to propose and adopt an aftermarket structure for the project. And we thought that this would be best to incentivize the private sector to be there, deliver its operational efficiencies, but also for the public partner to be involved all throughout. What is this affirmage structure? I think it's a French word. So if you think of PPPs as a range, from one end, you have a simple, basic O&M contract. And on the other hand, you have a full-blown concession contract. An affirmage structure is somewhere in the middle. It's like a lease structure, but with differences, slight differences. So we thought that this would be the best one to incentivize both parties to be involved all throughout. It's a 30-year project. Again, it's a 30-year project, so we needed to see the efficiencies from day one all the way to the end. And the efficiencies not just come from the private sector, but also the public partner. What do I mean? In an affirmage structure, the private partner is responsible for operating and maintaining the physical asset, as well as invoicing and collecting the tariff from the users. And the physical asset will be funded through the tariffs collected, as well as government support or subsidies. So that means traditional procurement or the public procurement method for the physical assets would have to be done. So that's the higher level of involvement from the public counterpart. Again, because of the very high infrastructure cost, we also found this to be the most cost-optimal solution because sovereign funding is inherently cheaper than private funding. So that also answers the question, why not a concession contract? Higher capital cost will eventually lead to higher project cost and then higher tariffs for the end users. And that would also mean for the government higher subsidies because they don't want to shock the consumer with a dramatic increase in tariffs. That would just not work. So we do have a plan to give subsidies to sort of soften the blow of the increase, and that would taper off after the first few years. Of course, if you also go to a bank, then you'd have a time delay to get this closed. And the state of infrastructure, the district heating network, just could not afford any more delays. They needed to act on it right away. In fact, I think that was 2022, where there was a very, very harsh winter. And we were just starting then the actual work for the district heating network. So a lot of people started to suffer. On the other hand, why not an O&M contract? It does not, an O&M contract does not incentivize both the private partner and the public partner to work together as much as an affirmage would. So we think the affirmage model works best. It will be a real collaboration, a real partnership between the two parties. What does it look like for the specific project? Lots of arrows. First, we have the two main stakeholders. We have the Tashkent City Municipality, which is our client, our advisory client, and also the counterpart, the public partner counterpart of the private partner in the blue box. So they have the PPP agreement between them, which we help them negotiate. It is, I think, an 800 or 900-page document because not only does it list the roles and responsibilities of each private partner, but it also enumerates and specifies the process for the way that they should be doing things. Because this is very new to the government, affirmage structures are actually typically used in the water sector and in civil law jurisdictions. So as far as we know, this is actually the first time that this model is being used for district heating. So there was a lot of learning to be done. And so that is all spelled out in the PPP agreement. Now, I mentioned earlier that there was some sort of government subsidy or support. And this is coming from, one, the investment part of the project, the physical asset, and two, the day-to-day operations of the private partner, because again, we don't want to shock the consumers who's used to paying a fixed amount of tariff, by the way, based on the size of their apartments. Now we're installing meters so that the tariffs will be based on actual usage. So we needed some government subsidy just to soften the blow, just gradually increase the tariffs until we find a more acceptable level of tariffs, and the service level as well is greatly improved. So that will improve acceptability. We have created the Tashkent District Heating Infrastructure Fund. That's the orange oval. And that is basically the repository for all the funds, the tariffs collected by the private partner, as well as the government subsidy for the investment component. So that goes into upkeep, the pipeline rehab, and other capital expenditures. So the private partner also does spend on some assets. So they do have the operating assets like the meters and communication devices, things like that. Yeah, so that is how it looks like. Very proud to say it looks a little bit complex, but ADB OMDP is also there with the client up to now, Tashkent City Municipality, during project implementation. Time is up. Just to share that, to make sure that it's a very complex project, right? And we're trying to make sure that the public partner moves from operator of the network to regulator plus plus. So we're hoping that after a few years, even when ADB is gone and not there by their side, they can do it on their own. In fact, they're very happy with the progress that we have another mandate with them for another city, Bukhara. So we're doing that. It's a smaller city, but it has its own challenges as well. And we're hoping that we can replicate this model, maybe for district cooling, which is something that I think is quite relevant, especially for those countries in this side of Asia. Okay, so just my last slide, I just wanted to show, after full implementation, we do expect these efficiencies to come about. Full implementation in the beginning when we signed the contract was just after 10 years, where you see the green web. That's all of the modernized pipelines. But very recently, the government and the private partner decided they want to change this, they want to accelerate it, they're going to do it within 5 years. So we're very happy about that as well. My time is up. So thank you so much. Here's Sharyar.
Thank you very much, Grace. So from Tashkent, I would like to take you all the way to a scenic part of the world called the Maldives. Maldives, just a bit of a country context. Island nation, as we all know, very susceptible to climate change. It's more than 1,000 islands, of about 200 are inhabited, and majority of the electricity generation is diesel based. Now, diesel, we all know, very much high in pollution, high in cost. So the tariff levels anywhere between 15 cents to about 40, 50 cents in the outer islands. And we're talking about all these distributed islands. Apart from Malé, we have all the others, about 190 inhabited islands. ADB has been a strong partner of the government of Maldives over the many years. Since 2014, we have been working with the government on accelerating and solarizing the country, reducing diesel as much as possible. And recently, over the past 2 to 3 years, the focus is a bit more on bringing in the private sector to do PPPs or projects in IPP mode. So in this context, ADB is helping the government in structuring a 20 megawatt project split into a 14.7 megawatt project, which is a land and rooftop based in the outer islands. And the more interesting one, which I'll be talking about today, is a marine floating solar in the ocean, which is 5 megawatt in 4 islands in the outer islands of the country. It will be like any other IPP or PPP project that you'll see. We'll have a power purchase agreement, we have an implementation agreement, all the bells and whistles, very typical that all of you might have observed. it is a one ADB collaboration between various departments within. So for example, OMDP, Office of Markets Development, is providing the transaction advisory, which is the blue part that you see, which is the solar IPP. And on the green, on the right side, which FINACA is the electric utility, our sovereign colleagues from the public sector group are got board approval for a project called Assure, accelerating sustainable system development using renewable energy. And Assure project scope is essentially the battery energy storage systems, plus the grid upgrades, plus the energy management systems. So that project sits on the right side, which is the green element. And then the private party will come in and deploy the two solar IPPs, the 14.7 megawatt and the 5 megawatt, because we thought that getting BESS and other components into the private partner scope will be quite expensive and quite difficult. So we were able to mobilize some grants, and this green part will be done in EPC mode for the BESS and the grid upgrades. Project structure, as I mentioned earlier, very much similar to internationally bankable IPPs: design, build, finance, operate, and transfer. 15-year PPA term. Private partner will be coming in for an international competitive bid. The bidding for the 14.7 megawatt is ongoing, whereas we plan to launch this floating solar tender at the end of the year. Public partner will be FINACA, which is the electric utility. Risk mitigation support is something interesting because we're all talking about bankable projects. So here, of course, we have worked with MIGA from the World Bank Group to provide political risk cover for equity investment. Then for offtake payments, because IPPs are new in the country, we have an escrow account mechanism where some funds are there, and which we have mobilized from a trust fund that ADB manages called Asia Climate Finance Fund. So there's some funds there to mitigate the offtake risk of any delayed payments or any FX conversion risk. And then on number 3, we have, because of the high cost of solar deployment, we have a performance-based incentive to lower the tariff for the project party. So if they achieve COD on time in budget, they get a performance incentive, which essentially lowers the tariff, again mobilized from our friends from ACLIF. Project structure, very similar. We have a special purpose vehicle in the center and all sorts of contracts left, right, and center, as you see. So we have the financing agreements on the top. You will see the lenders and the sponsors providing equity and debt. We have the EPC contract, the O&M. Power purchase agreement is with the off-taker. Implementation agreement is with the Ministry of Energy. Very similar to other IPPs. And now we move to some of the interesting aspects which make this project quite unique, and one of the world's first projects, IPP projects, to be developed in an ocean or marine environment. So this is one particular site that we have. So on the extreme right, you can see there's a beach, so all the waves are coming in on the extreme right. And then you see an asphalt strip. So that's essentially an airport. That's a new airport in the island of Muli. It's all reclaimed land. And then the yellow one is, this is one particular island of the 4. And I think I'm trying to highlight how important it is to select the sites. So for example, the site on the left, as you see, it's the dark blue on the extreme left is the open sea. And then the light blue is the lagoon. And then you can see it's protected by a reef over here. So site selection for an offshore or like a nearshore marine project is really important, because we need to ensure that there aren't corals or seagrass because of the environmental safeguards issue. Then the land should not be shallow, typically more than 2 meters, because otherwise there's beaching effect. Beaching is when in the low tide there's no water, so your solar system will rest on the sea surface. So you don't want that. Ideally, it should be more than 2 meters. So there are a lot of considerations on this particular aspect. So this yellow one is where the site is, and then you see the powerhouse about 100 to 200 meters away. And then because of the airport, you need to do some studies on the reflective aspects and all. So generally, if you're trying to do floating solar, generally has been done more on lakes, reservoirs, and these kind of water bodies where you don't have phenomena related to currents and waves. So you're trying to deploy a floating project. What can go wrong? Here you go. So as you can clearly see, these systems were generally done on lakes and reservoirs, but because of the winds can generate high waves, and then you can end up with something like this, which we would want to avoid. So then a crash course, Oceanography 101. So the key challenges for a marine floating project compared to one doing in a river, in a lake or reservoir is a presence of strong currents and waves, which which will impact the system stability as well as the anchoring of the floating PV system. So if it's a reservoir, you can simply anchor it to the bottom, anchor and moor it. So because you don't have an open sea rough environment. And what exactly do we talk about currents and waves? Currents generally are subsea phenomena, so below the surface of the ocean, predictable and directional movements because of temperature and pressure difference. And it's a combination of wind, sun, gravity, and Earth's rotation. So wind on the surface, from the sun, there will be temperature differential. And then the gravity, of course, is there. And then Earth's rotation, all these things combine together to give us the phenomena of subsea currents. And prevailing winds create peaks and valleys in the oceans. And then number two is the waves, which is more of a surface phenomena. So ocean currents currents move across the oceans, thousands of kilometers away. But waves are a more surface-driven phenomena. They move on the ocean surface and move on a much lower scale. And the problems that we see over here are more because of the waves, not because of the currents. So ocean waves, due to the force of the winds, rush across the surface of the water. And then, for example, here, if there's very high wind speed, then of course you might have waves even in a reservoir, and then you might end up with something like this. Wind speed, direction of gust, and area of water the wind blows impact the wave height. So the wave, because most likely the systems were not designed for a wave height of perhaps more than 1 meter. Typically, we see waves 1 to 2 meters, and that's how the systems are designed. So when we are talking about marine environment, what exactly do we need to do? So of course, to design a system, we need to measure both the currents and the waves. And then, I mean, this phenomenon is quite new because generally for floating PV in reservoirs or lakes, we don't do that. But as at ADB, we're trying to sort of make this marine floating solar more of an asset class, which can be used like in Maldives or in the Pacific, as well as in Africa and the Caribbean. So the equipment that you see on the top is for measuring the currents. It's called the Nautic Echo Profiler. Nautic is a company. It's a European company which provides this Echo Profiler. What it does is it's an equipment which uses Doppler effect to measure current speeds and direction. So it sits at the seas, at the bottom of the sea, as you can see, and it sends Doppler waves. So it's like sound waves. It's sending sound waves a few sound waves every second. And then it's able to map out when the wave reflects back. It maps out the speed and the direction of the water currents, and then you can see it divides the ocean into several columns, as we can see over here. All these are columns, water columns, and then this device will give you the data on the current's direction and the speed. And this is because we need this data because of the anchoring, because the floating system will sit on top and it will be anchored to the seabed. And if the currents are really strong, then your floating PV system, for example, if the currents move from left to right, your floating PV system will be all the time moved in the right direction, in the other direction, which you don't want. So that is why you need to design your anchoring system, which can take care of the strong currents. Ideally, you should have a place where the currents are less, but if they are more, then of course you need to add a bit more bit more thought about the anchoring. Lastly, the equipment that you see, it's a yellow-colored buoy. I'm not sure if everyone can see, but it's right over there. It gives you it's for the wave measurement. So minimum, maximum, and average wave height, wave frequency, and direction. So it's basically just a yellow kind of color buoy, which will and you can see the solar panels over there. It's provided by a company called SOFAR, and it's called a spotter buoy system. So it will just sit on the surface, and it will when the waves come up and down, it has sensors, and it will transmit you the data as well. And this is because your floating system will rest on the sea, and of course it has to withstand the waves. And with this data collection, you will pretty much give the designer what over like a 12-month period, what exactly is the minimum and maximum wave movement, because your system has to be able to withstand waves of 1 or 2 meter height. So this project is ongoing. I thought I'll discuss some of this project anyways, and then hopefully we'll make it a success over the coming months and years. Yeah, that's it. Look forward to receiving any questions or queries from you. Now perhaps we'll move to the panel discussion, and after the discussion we'll have a Q&A session. So in that perhaps you'll if you have any questions for Ankit on hydrogen or Grace on district heating or on this one, we'll be happy to answer. So with this, I would like to invite the panel members, Mr. Hussein Agil, Deputy Minister, Ministry of Environment, Climate Change and Energy, Government of the Maldives, Ms. Fiona Gulliford, Partner, Trinity Law, Mr. Jalal Khimji, Deputy CEO, ProParco, and Ms. Rosemary Yong from the Office of Markets Development and PPPs. Thank you very much. Perhaps if all my panel members can take about 30 seconds to introduce themselves, starting from Mr. Hussain.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Hussein Agil, and I'm the Deputy Minister for the Ministry of Climate Change, Environment and Energy. I have been working in the energy sector for the past 8 years, and I'm very much aware of the ADB interventions in the country of Maldives. So,
good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fiona Gulliford. I am a partner at Trinity International LLP. We are a law firm, and I focus primarily on emerging market projects, and the majority of my work does turn out to be renewable energy projects. A number of these projects I am working with ADB.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jalal Khimji, Deputy CEO of ProParco. So ProParco is 85% owned by the French Development Agency, which is the development bank for France. I'm very glad to be here.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rosemary Ong. I'm from the Office of Markets Development and PPP, along with Cleo, Shahryar, and Grace, who you've met earlier. And I'm working on the PPP project on the airport where you all have flown from. That is the Manila International Airport, or NAIA Airport.
Thanks a lot, everyone. So we have an interesting panel from representations from the government. From the legal side, I have not seen many lawyers at ASF, but I think from a legal policy regulatory reform perspective, lawyers are front and center of that. So Fiona is there. And then from a lender's perspective, we will get guidance from Mr. Jalal Khimji. And then Rosemary, as we all know, is our in-house airports expert. So airports being an interesting new sector, so we'll get some guidance from her as well and seek her views. So perhaps if I can start with Mr. Agil. So Mr. Agil, we saw about the floating solar case in the country, in the Maldives, but generally Maldives is, of course, quite at the cutting edge of climate change and climate action. Government is quite keen to develop new technologies, apart from solar, for example, tidal or ocean energy as well. So perhaps a bit more on what's the role of the governments and what is your government doing to encourage more private participation in new sectors?
yeah, thank you very much. Before I initiate my little bit more introduction about this thing, actually, I would like to extend my best wishes to everyone on the Environment Day, World Environment Day. So it's a very fitting day. Okay? So regarding the floating solar, actually, let's start with the very initial beginning of this Maldives renewable energy sector. Like 10 years before, Maldives doesn't have it had like 1% of renewable energy. Now, today it has like 5% renewable energy. Now our target is to reach 33% renewable energy by 2028. So in this regard, actually, we are very keen to introduce renewable energy, floating solar, as well as other sort of renewable energy technologies in Maldives. And we have been reviewing Energy Act so that private sector can intervene and increase our renewable energy penetration, as well as we have introduced PSIB, which is a private sector investment projects where companies can actually come in and submit their proposals to carry out the projects. And also we have SCZ, which is special economic zone. So any contractor which wants to invest in Maldives can come. And for the SCZ projects, the project value should be about $115 million. So it's not a competitive bid in any contractor who can actually carry out the projects can participate in those bidding. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Hussain. Fiona, so legal regulatory policy reform on the upstream side, really important. And then, of course, the bankability concern come more on the downstream side. So we saw about green hydrogen and district heating and some of the other interesting aspects. On the upstream side, what do you think on the legal policy regulatory reform and the government is trying to open up a new sector like green hydrogen or district heating? What are the critical steps that governments need to take? How can us as the development community support? And yeah, happy to hear your views.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Sharia. I think often that the legal and regulatory, unfortunately, tends to be the last thing people think about when they want to put together a project. And it may seem perhaps one of the most obvious, but when you're looking at new projects, green hydrogen, for example, if you go into country, most jurisdictions, the existing legislation hasn't necessarily caught up with the advancements in technology. It may be very unclear what regime you need to actually enact your project under. Is it governed by a PPP law? Is it governed by another sector-specific law? Licensing and permitting regimes, all of these things, it may not be clear how you actually manage your project with your licensing. There could be many competing authorities who have jurisdiction over various aspects of the project. That in itself is obviously a regulatory conflict, but it can also add unnecessary complexity and confusion to obviously private sector developers. The other things to sort of be aware of, I guess, in terms of sort of regulatory challenges is the time it can take to procure certain approvals. There's not always a very streamlined process for this. If you're looking at tech like solar, which is quite easily and more flexibly deployed in comparison to things like hydropower, where there's obviously more intense environmental and social issues, you obviously want to be able to move fairly quickly within a time schedule that is suitable for that project. And then there are basic things on sort of energy projects. You may have a grid code that hasn't really been designed for projects that are non-fossil fuels. So there are a number of challenges just inherent to, I think, build into your timeline when you are going into country and starting a Pathfinder project. I think institutions like ADB are obviously invaluable in terms of helping the government to manage how they themselves are going to internally organize themselves. Can they make the process simpler for developers by creating online application systems, sitting down with the government and working through sort of legal and regulatory reforms, because all these things need to be done before a project can go out to tender.
Thanks, Fiona. So over to Jalal from ProParco, the French DFI. So Jalal, you bring us a lender's perspective. So please enlighten us about ProParco's role in Asia and Africa, and what sort of new climate Pathfinder projects that ProParco has financed, and what are the key learnings? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So just for those who don't really know us, so we are active across the globe. On an annual basis, we are deploying around 2.5 billion euro of financing, and 20% of our activity is basically in Asia. So on an annual basis, we are deploying around $500 million of financing through different forms, actually. be it debt, equity, or everything in between. So in Asia, our strategy is really to focus on two main pillars. One is everything which can, in some way or another, protect the planet, and be it climate, be it biodiversity, or everything related to environment. And the second pillar is basically the reduction of the inequality, because basically we can't take care of the planet without taking care of the people, obviously. So those are the main pillars, and a cross-cutting objective for us, which resonates quite well with the topic of our conference, and this is across the globe, is basically to have a particular focus on financing innovation. So concretely for us, our objectives for our 5-year plan is somehow to double the volume of projects which contains some sort of innovation compared to what it was in 2022. The objective is to double it by 2025. So, and what we mean by innovation, obviously, as it was illustrated before, it can be different form of innovation. It can be technological, it can be business model, it can be structuring type of innovation. And obviously this needs for us a specific shift, and like all DFIs. And the type of things we put on the table for our new strategy is basically of different kind. One, it was to have a strategic impulse, really to fund innovation. That's obviously clear, and that's the mandate given by our board. The second is to have specific teams focusing on specific types of innovation. So since a couple of years now, we have a team specifically focusing on VC, so on venture capital, financing startups directly or indirectly. We have a dedicated subsidiary which we created, which is called Digital Africa, specifically focusing on financing startup mainly in Africa, because Africa remains 50% of what we are doing globally. So that's a second ingredient. So first, strategic impulse. Second, HR. So HR, I was talking about VC. We have also a team specifically focusing on nature-based solution. The third ingredient is obviously working on our own risk appetite. So working with our risk department, having green light from our board to move the needle vis-a-vis our own risk appetite. It's not easy, but I think that we clearly worked on it for our new strategy. And the fourth, I think, tools that we put in place is have specific type of instrument, basically blended finance, either for technical assistance to do some studies and with private sectors, or it could be concessional financing used in a very specific case to lower the cost of financing from a lending perspective. But it can also be for ourselves a risk protection mechanism, so that we can go further in terms of risk appetite. So that's basically the strategy we put in place. And I think that one of the characteristics of DFIs, such as ourselves, but also ADB, IFC, and all other DFIs, is that we can work through different means. We can work directly on some projects. That's what we are doing currently in some floating solar project in Indonesia, or in Uzbekistan with BESS type of projects for battery energy storage for solar system. So those projects that you described earlier. So that's one way to work. A second way is basically to work with financial institution. That's also, I think, very important, and to put specific incentive on those institutions so that they can finance innovation. We can guarantee part of their risk, and we would say, if you finance this type of innovation, then we can guarantee a higher portion of the risk you are taking. So that's another way to work and to push innovation. And the last but not least, obviously, financing with VC funds, a different type of funds on the equity side in order, again, here to push innovation. And I will just finish by saying that I think that the value added of institutions such as Proparco is one, we have a global presence, meaning that innovation, I mean, good idea can come from everywhere around the world. So good idea which are tested here and which work, we can use it in Africa and vice versa. We are talking about clean cooking earlier today, and I think that this is a huge issue in Africa, and I think that good kind of experience here can be implemented there in Africa and vice versa. So that's one value added, and the second one is we are part of AFD group, so we can work at different level, like ADB, working hand in hand with our mother company to enable things at the government level, work with them, but we can also then work at the project level. So that's what we are trying to do at different in different levels in order to push innovation.
Thank you so much, Jalal. Rosemary, so you work a lot on the transport and the airport space in Southeast Asia and adjoining countries. So give us a flavor of the climate considerations and development of new airports as well as the expansions, and what's the latest that's happening in Southeast Asia and in this sector? Because outside of the power sector, transport is one of the key carbon emitting sectors. So what are we doing in that space?
Thanks, Shaharya. So in Southeast Asia, there have been some, as you all know, most of the airports, specifically in Southeast Asia, are actually government run. And in Southeast Asia, there are governments who actually have state-owned enterprises who actually own the airport concessions. Now, one exception to that is the Philippines, where in the Philippines there is a very big push to encourage private sector participation, and there is also this need for the government acknowledges that the private sector can do a much better job in terms of managing some climate issues. So, for example, in the Ninoy Aquino International Airport transaction that we had recently closed, one of the key issues that you may have all experienced is that there is a very acute issue of congestion. Now, airport congestion will mean that the planes or flights are usually circling before you land. And how many of you may have come to Manila and your flight would need to circle a few times before you actually land? And I see a few smiling faces. And that is because NAIA is very space and slot constrained. Now, one of the key things in transaction structuring that we have taken into consideration is to optimize the runway capacity of NAIA. Now, for most of you who are familiar with the airport, it is in the middle of the city. There is no more space for expansion, and the only way for government to solve the congestion issue and reduce the reduce greenhouse gases by helping to reduce the fuel burnt by flights that are very inefficiently run simply because there are no slots at NAIA. Now, one way of doing that is to incorporate in our project structure a significant push to maximize and optimize runway capacity. And we've done this through two things. First is by ensuring that there is mandatory infrastructure works that need to address the current constraints by within the airport, and this is done through runway resurfacing, reconfiguration of the apron, etc. More importantly, a key driver is technology. So by implementing better technology for air traffic, our air traffic control is able to anticipate and manage the airflow such that there will be an higher movements per hour. Now, in terms of resilient, as you all know, we are airports and other transport infrastructure is actually very susceptible and vulnerable to rising sea levels. Manila is no exception. If you have floods in Manila, the runway would usually close, and that is not only inefficient, but there's actually a lot of productivity loss. So one aspect that we have incorporated in the transaction in terms of climate adaptation is to mandate the concessionaire to provide climate change or flood mitigation strategy. Now, whether the concessionaire will, the concessionaire is also required to conduct a whole study to ensure that the airport would be able to or is resilient to a certain level of increased precipitation. There's also a big push for in our project structure to encourage the use of sustainable aviation fuel. Now, as you know, whilst the airport as an asset would be able to incorporate a lot of climate change and climate adaptation measures, the major role is really to encourage airlines to switch to SAF or sustainable aviation fuel. And in the NAIA transaction, the way we have addressed this is to provide a discounted rate for the fuel flowage fees if they are using sustainable aviation fuel. So we hope that that will motivate airlines to switch faster. Another philosophy that is adopted in the project structure for NAIA is in terms of the philosophy around rates and charges. So by incorporating development cost into the rates and charges will ensure that development or infrastructure spent towards climate adaptation and some climate change measures will be implemented, because there is some fees that could potentially compensate the concessionaire for. The perhaps one of the boldest move that we have done as well is to require the renewable energy, to require the concessionaire a minimum of 20% of its current or of its energy demand to come from or to be sourced from renewable sources. And we have also mandated the concessionaire of the airport to install solar panels wherever they can within the project land. Now, we have to be mindful of reflection, etc. So that will now form part of the deliverables of the private sector. The use of technology is also a major source. The modernization of technology in the airport is also a major source of fuel or energy efficiency. And last but not least, we have also adopted, and this is the first time for Philippine PPP transactions, that we have adopted the Energy Guarantee Fund mechanism. So this will ensure that the grantors or the Department of Transportation and the Manila International Airport Authority will have a source of funding to address any environmental issues throughout the project life. And this is again the first time that we are doing this in the Philippines, and we have been successful, having achieved commercial close last March. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rosemary, for this comprehensive update on the project itself. We'll do one more round and then we'll go to the audience for Q&A. So Mr. Sen, as we talked earlier, so Maldives very much highly dependent on diesel. Diesel, of course, is expensive, is polluting, is difficult to transport, is noisy. So, but again, it is the solution that has been there. But we're trying to sort of reduce that with solar, with battery storage, with other technologies. So, what is the government doing on the upstream side, on the policy regulatory side, to encourage private sector to come in for other solutions? It can be even like LNG or gas to power, because again, as long as it is reducing the high emitting and more expensive diesel. So just enlighten us, what is your government looking at various technologies, and what are the incentives for the private sector to come and invest?
Thank you very much. Yeah, actually, the government has, like I mentioned previously, government has introduced the PSIP as well as the SCZ for the private sector to express their interest in conducting this project. We also like to see more new technologies other than floating PV as well. Like there is when you consider Maldives is a lot of tiny islands, which is like 1,100 islands. So it's a lot dispersed in the ocean is what we actually have. So if we consider to utilize what are the resources we have, the ocean technology is something which we could actually review or have feasibilities and conduct more projects considering the ocean current, wind, or take as in ocean thermal energy. So as the government, actually, we are willing to explore all these new technologies within the country, and we are welcoming private sector to come to Maldives with projects like these new technologies. And also government is actually given initiatives like if it is a renewable energy project, the import duty is zero, so it's free. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. Fiona, you work a lot with project developers as well as on the government side, bankability. So we all talked about on the 4 presentations about the key risk allocation and all, but just to hear from your thoughts based on your experience in, for example, Africa and some parts of Asia as well. So what do you see for role for the government, the developers and the lenders to address all those bankability gaps that were highlighted by Ankit, that were highlighted by the other colleagues as well? Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question. I think in common with any project, be it sort of new tech or not, climate friendly or not, there are some sort of common denominators in terms of just general risk allocation for developers. There are the usual sort of contractual protections that any developer will need to see in its project documentation when we're talking about the bigger projects with government, particularly, for example, like your cooling project, or things like the project in the Maldives. Obviously, there are inherent risks that can't really be feasibly taken by the private sector. So we would expect, when parties are sitting down to negotiate documentations, whether that's ADB in its capacity as reviewing as a lender or in its advisory capacity, we would obviously expect to see usual protections in terms of things like political force majeure regimes, change in law regimes, assurances and support from government, really, which is pretty crucial to have government as an invested partner to help support the developer where they may have difficulties, for example, with currency exchange, where there may be liquidity issues, just to help with licensing, permitting, customs, import and export. All of those sorts of problems can arise. I think if we're looking particularly at some of the new tech, I think a lot of the things that we've seen in both Africa and in Asia, particularly where we're looking at projects like the Maldives, or we're looking at other smaller renewable projects, because solar, by its nature, excluding places like Uzbekistan, where you're seeing huge sort of solar projects, a lot of solar projects tend to be on the smaller side compared to obviously big thermal projects, is the fact that there is more of a need for concessional financing for these types of innovative projects. And I think the Maldives project is a really good example of that, where obviously to make this project bankable, it's high capex upfront costs for a developer, but equally there is significant pressure from governments to keep tariffs down. This is where green climate funds can be absolutely invaluable because they can come in and help reduce that tariff. In the Maldives, that's been done through the actual contractual documentation by including a performance incentive, as Shariar mentioned earlier. In other projects, particularly I'm thinking of things like decentralized power, that can be seen through various sort of targets for connections in off-grid projects where you get subsidies for every few thousand connections that you make. But I think in terms of bankability, looking at more innovative ways of structuring your project, perhaps rather than just applying a typical project financing model, is something that is quite crucial.
Thanks a lot, Fiona. Jalal, I mean, you come from the DFI community. I mean, and at MDBs and DFIs, there's a whole talk of from billions to trillions, where perhaps the MDBs and DFIs' role is more to sort of crowd in the private sector investment. But from Proparco's perspective, what are you doing? And perhaps any cases of working in Africa or Asia, which you will highlight in the same regard? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We'll try to be quick since we have 10 seconds left for both of us. Okay, I'm just joking, but no, I think it's a difficult one, but just to throw a few ideas on the table. One, I think that there is an urgent need of knowledge sharing. Knowledge sharing in terms of innovation, and we talked about it. What is done across the globe should be shared. What works, what doesn't work. And we really need to open our own books as multilaterals, DFIs. And on that front, I think that there is also currently discussion amongst MDBs, DFIs, also to share sensitive data about how our loans are performing around the world. What is the risk return profile? So that the more knowledge there is on the table, the easier it is for, I guess, private investor to choose and invest. So that's one. I think there is also a need of knowledge sharing about what all the DFI, IFIs community is doing. I think that there are a huge number of initiatives, be it from a startup who are looking for financing, SMEs, or large projects. It's not easy, basically, to navigate around across what the DFI community, IFI community is offering. So I think there needs to communicate on what is available. And I think it's key, actually. The second thing, I think, as we said earlier, us as DFIs, IFIs, needs to work on our own, not only on two fronts. One is our own risk appetite, and it's not easy. We all have our credit committees and our stakeholders who are saying, on the one hand, you need to take more risk, but whenever level of risk or financial performance are not there, they might change their mind. So actually there is, on our own side, a need to move the needle. You talked about blending. I think there is an increasing volume of blending on the table, but it needs to be used properly in order to mobilize and to use blending where it's needed. Last but not least, I think we need also to work at different level, not only at the project level with different type of mechanism, but also on the government level, including with financial regulators or also rating agencies. Because today, for a private investor, a private bank, to invest even in a very good project, in some countries, it's very difficult from a capital perspective. Even a very good project with an intrinsic value credit rating, which is very high, very good actually, if the country risk is not so good. Actually, there is a ceiling. So at the end of the day, for a private investor, it's quite difficult. And I think that and there are current discussion in different forum to see how we can work with rating agencies, for example, so that they can have a more granular understanding of the risk, and that when there is ADB, for example, around the table, it provide a certain type of coverage, of confidence, etc. Those rating agency needs to look at those projects a bit more carefully and not just put the ceiling in terms of credit risk, the country ceiling. So I think there is this need to work at different level if we want to move from the billions to trillions, and I guess that's the spirit of what we are doing, and we're trying to do at different levels.
Thanks a lot, Jalal. Rosemary, in 30 seconds, maybe one or two quick learnings from the Manila project which can be applied for future projects. In the meantime, please, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand.
Yes. So thanks, Shahariyar. One of the key takeaway is really to balance the in order to achieve bankability, there needs to be a balance with the need to modernize and to optimize an airport facility, with that of also ensuring that there's sustainability through climate adaptation and climate change measures. And that's what we've tried to achieve in NAIA. Thank you.
So any questions from the audience? Okay, we have one.
Hi, my name is Herbert from Indonesia. The first question is, the project is in front of your eyes, like, to penetrate the renewable energy using the solar panel, and then complement with storage battery. This is very bankable. It's in front of your eyes, and you can use it for airport. The question is, why don't you put the money where the project is bankable? Like, open a solar panel factory in each country, complement with storage battery, like long duration energy storage that can be complemented with the solar and wind on and offshore. The second question is, we have plenty of palm oil in Indonesia, and we have already tested with ex-cooking oil, and we flew the airplane from Central Java to Jakarta, but it is from used cooking oil. Until today, it is very difficult in terms of quantity. I think the future, why don't you put the money in the bankable project to use crude palm oil or sugarcane for biofuel, and then for sustainable air fuel, aviation fuel for, from crude palm oil or CPO. Last but not least, we will be running out of dispatchable baseload, hydro, geothermal in 2038, meaning 15 years from 2038, we have to start thinking about another option like clean energy, small modular reactor. This is what we have to think, and then couple with generative artificial intelligence. Thank you.
I think on the best aspect, perhaps Fiona, you can take that. I think on the manufacturing of solar, perhaps in a lot of countries have tried it and they have put in duties on imports, but that's not the most optimal way to do it. But there's a balance between developing the local industry versus having cost-effective generation, because the PRC, as we all know, is home to 90% of production. It will always be much cheaper. So bit of a balance. On the best, maybe Fiona, on the best investments, I think it's more on the bankability of the best projects, how to develop best plus the solar in like airports and other areas.
Yeah, sure. So obviously, so sort of best storage obviously is a really popular topic at the moment. Obviously, it makes sense in terms of being able to utilize your you've got your solar panels, you can store your energy, it makes sense. And it obviously offers quite a good solution. I think what a lot of people forget is that when you are structuring a project and you're looking at its bankability, it's important to remember that the way in which you manage the term of your generating facility and the way in which you manage the BESS are two sort of completely different entities. So I think it sounds sort of rather basic, but I think one of the starting points is to consider, why have you got battery storage? I mean, what are you using it for? And I think often when we are advising governments and they say, yay, we want storage, and for our solar projects, you sort of sit back and ask them, well, why do you want storage? Is it because you know that between this time and this time you are going to need to utilize that battery? Or in some cases, people haven't really thought it through and they think they're going to have a battery that's just going to sit there running available 24/7, which obviously, given that batteries degrade fairly significantly quite quickly, is not cost effective and is not efficient. So I think in terms of bankability, I think one of the reasons why sometimes it may seem to developers a little bit more challenging to get your battery storage perhaps approved as part of the overall project cost is because you need to be able to justify why you are using it. Obviously, the battery component does tend to be, or has typically been, a little bit more expensive vis-a-vis the rest of the project cost. So I think it really needs to be judged on a project by project basis. And it's important to remember that in your actual contract agreements and your PPAs, you again need to think about, what are you going to do with your battery if it's not available? Are you going to run a completely different take and pay type regime if it's not available, alongside the availability that you've actually got for your plant? And it's also important to remember that that battery storage won't last for the term of your typical PPA period. So you'll probably find it lasts, on average, I've seen sort of battery storage lasting around sort of, say, 7-8 years, when obviously a typical PPA in an ideal scenario is, 20 years or 15 to 20 years plus.
No, just to add perhaps what you said, that there are good examples of financing with large battery storage around the world. So I guess that, again, I come back to this point of knowledge sharing of what works, what doesn't work, including vis-a-vis the point you just raised about the lifetime of a battery storage. There are some solutions in terms of oversizing capacity, etc., etc. Again, I would just advise to use examples which worked around the globe or which doesn't work, in order to learn from those.
Thanks. And I think one quick question for Rosemary. Is ADB working with the government on the Clark Airport project? Because the idea was to replace or some traffic to Clark. So are we doing anything over there? Or any other airports in the Philippines?
Yeah, so not on Clark. That has been awarded, I think, a couple of years ago. But we have been mandated by the same client, Department of Transportation, for regional airports. And there is also a big, the Department of Transport is also wanting to incorporate sustainability measures, especially for tourism base airports. And these are smaller regional airports in the country.
Thanks, Rosemary. So if there are no other questions, may I ask Mr. Azim Hashmi, Director for South Central and West Asia in the Office of Markets Development and PPPs, for the closing remarks.
Okay. Thank you. Good evening now. I will not ask you about your energy levels. I will just a few things that I took from here, and based on our team's experience, you saw a few examples been presented, and maybe perhaps I can summarize what our experience has been. I think the first one is that Pathfinder projects do exist. If they are to happen, They need to be made bankable, and you saw in the case of the India example, also in the case of Maldives examples, there are innovative methodologies that can be adopted to make those projects cross the bankability threshold that is a bit more appealing to our credit committees. The other is upstream work is paramount. While projects are interesting, legal, regulatory, and policy reforms is equally important. It needs to be done because these are the first projects of their kind. Some of the laws may have to be changed. Some of the capacities have to be built up. But however, at the same time, the project can move ahead. And that brings me to my third point. While the project moves ahead, it's extremely important that the projects are studied thoroughly. Projects, Shariar gave example of what are some of the technologies or the modern technologies that are being adopted. Data is extremely important. And this is something that we hear from when we do our market feedback sessions. If the projects are studied well and they're structured well, they will get in good bidders, and the government will actually get better value for money. And last but not least, one of the most important things is when you do these Pathfinder projects, some of them, I mean, most of them, we are doing them with PPPs. So, well, one part of it is the private, the other part of it is the public. The public capacity, and Grace touched on this in the case of Tashkent, the public capacity and the ability to engage after the agreements are signed and after the financing close has happened is extremely important. The first, the most critical time of these projects is the first 3-4 years. You get it right, you have a replicable project. This is our lesson that we learned from our Tashkent. I hope you have all benefited, and hopefully the presentations and our panelists allowed you to sort of see it from a different lens. With that, I wish you all a good evening and a pleasant stay here in Manila. Thank you so much.